you're in a good place now. You are listening to Perspectives with Ashley Burgess.
Welcome back live to Live Your True Life Perspectives, and I am your host, Ashley Burgess. On today's show, we're going to be talking about relationships, and more specifically, different types of relationships that we see more often nowadays, and how these relationships are shaping the thought processes of all of us. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable, understanding, grasping different types of relationships to understand why they exist and what's the value of them, as well as pushing some of the boundaries that I think many of us have about relationships. And I know that monogamous relationships are really, the most accepted style of relationship. Doing what I do on a daily basis, working with clients, more often than not, most people are in a monogamous relationship. Some people have stepped out of the marriage or are currently seeking something else. Some people have divorced because they weren't getting what they wanted in the marriage and looking for someone to be able to connect with. And one of the biggest things that's so important is we don't want to get in a relationship because we need that person to make us happy. And I think that's where a lot of times things fall by the wayside, because we get into a relationship to have someone make us feel good or to do things for us or to make us happy, when in reality, we are the only person that can actually make ourselves happy. I mean, definitely somebody can bring joy into our lives, but we can't be stuck in that thought process as far as, I need this person to make my life good, I need to have this person to make my life happy, whatever that looks like. And I find it interesting lately, too. There's a lot of folks that have stepped out of the normal type of relationship, the relationship that many of us have in our life. Many of us are married to a man or a woman. Many of us have kids. We go to work every day. We do this. We rinse and repeat. But some of our friends and some of the people we know and some of our coworkers don't have that type of relationship. They're dealing with a different type of relationship. And I want to talk about that in today's show, because I think that a lot of times we don't really understand certain situations, and this is not an endorsement, nor is it any sort of judgment. It's just about educating ourselves to understand what some people are choosing nowadays over the monogamous relationship. And a lot of people are choosing a polyamorous relationship. And polyamorous and polyamorous couples, see their relationships as consensual, non-monogamous relationships. So that would be a C&M relationship, a consensual, non-monogamous relationship where everybody involved is aware of the relationship, aware of any sort of levels in that relationship, and has consented to be involved in these relationships. So there's more to just a simple open relationship that we hear when people say, oh, I'm in an open relationship, or they have an agreement, they're in an open relationship. There's more to it than that. There's more levels. There's more types of relationships. There's different situations involved. It's some types of rules as well that are also involved. And so we're going to be talking about that in today's show here on Live Your True Life Perspectives. And, polyamory and being polyamorous is interesting because it exists all over the world, right? It exists all over the world. It's not just in one country. There's many people that are in these types of relationships. And I'm not talking about polygamy. I know that some people say, well, wait a second. I know that polygamy is when you can marry all these people. You can have multiple wives or multiple spouses. And that's not what we're talking about. So we probably want to get that out of the way right now, because when we think about polygamy, we think of something different. Usually in polygamy, we think about men that are able to have multiple wives. We think about also, the specific gender situation. Usually it's completely heterosexual traditionally. They can have multiple spouses. One man can have multiple wives, multiple partners. There's also a religious component usually to that as well. There are some religions that allow this to be, throughout the country, in the United States, as well as throughout the world. And various religions. And so we want to make sure that we realize that we're not talking about polygamy in today's show. So that's something completely different. It's a different type of animal. we're looking at what polyamorous is, and we're looking at the different types of polyamorous relationships. And so whether or not you're interested in this, or whether or not you're just kind of interested in the fact of understanding it, because I think this is something that we hear more often than not nowadays. And, polyamory it's kind of the term that's used for, like we talked about, the consensual non-monogamous relationships. And there's different kinds of these relationships that you can have. And one of the types is a monopoly relationships. And these are unique relationships. They're different than one person in a monogamous, right? So what happens is that you have someone, it's because one person in the relationship is monogamous and the other person identifies as polyamorous. So how does that work? And that's interesting. And usually in those situations, the polyamorous person wants to pursue other relationships outside of that person that wants to continue to be monogamous. And the monogamous partner is interested in dating and being, sexually active with the polyamorous partner, but only wants to be with that person. They don't want to be with anybody else. They don't want to go out and meet anybody. They're not interested in anybody else. So they're only interested in dating and being with or married to that particular person. Now, there's a lot of reasons why people find themselves in a monopoly relationship. A lot of times they find themselves because maybe the person is older and doesn't have the same sex drive. Maybe there's mixed match sexual desires. There could be different things that go along with that. And a lot of times people kind of fall into these relationships by accident. They connect with each other. They love one another. They're there, and they kind of fall into the relationship because it works, and that's the option. And also that's kind of the deal, is that this kind of comes hand in hand in the relationship. Also, it's interesting too. A lot of people begin these types of relationships when they were both in a monogamous relationship. And one person decides to tell the other person that they're interested in pursuing other relationships. And when that person discloses that information, the other person who wants to stay monogamous can either stay or not stay. And that's interesting. So some relationships obviously do probably end or break up, or people get divorced over the situation. But some people are able to make this work to save the relationship. So it's based on the desires of one person and the other person being able to allow that to be so that the other person gets what they want or what they're interested, and they can still hold on to this relationship and have that. And it works for some people out there. I definitely want to have a show where we talk to many people in some polyamorous relationships and understanding, how it started, what were some of the pitfalls, what are some of the fears that go into it, because I'm sure that you have to overcome some fears, and that's something that definitely needs to be discussed. But I know that nowadays, in my work, how often I hear so many people's relationships where they're not having sex. They're not having sex with their partner. Sex dried up a long time ago, or it's been really challenging to have that discussion. Or how do we open that conversation? How do we communicate that? How do we talk about that? What do we say there? How do we communicate these types of situations? But also, once we have communicated, if things are not able to be augmented or changed, what can we do to keep that person in your life, but still be able to have some of the things that you want as well? And that's definitely something that needs to be talked about, because I think that the sex component is something that affects the marriage so much. The sex component is something that it's not the end all be all, but I think that when somebody feels as though that is not available to them, many people would leave a relationship that ultimately is a good relationship because there is no sex, where if the other person was able to find that sexual intimacy somewhere else, perhaps they could still safeguard the relationship. And I'm not saying this is an end-all be-all cure for everybody out there, but I'm saying this is a possibility that, being in a mono-poly relationships especially if somebody's not sexual, has a low sex drive, maybe an asexual individual, it can even improve that relationship with the other person. Because think about it, if the other person's not being pressured to have sex, that, taking that pressure off that other person could be very helpful to them, because they could be very stressed out too, because it's maybe something that they don't want or something that they're not into, but yet the rest of the relationship seems to be working very well. There's a friendship, there's a connection, maybe there's children that they're bringing up, maybe there's a business connection as well, that they're working together in work as well, but they also do love each other at the core. There's just maybe this particular situation that's causing an issue as well. And that's interesting. Another situation too, so let's get past this concept of the monopoly, is the solo, polyamorous relationship. You'll see that there's normally a primary partner in these relationships, and someone who practices that solo polyamorous relationship prioritizes themselves over any person that they're dating. So they seem to put themselves first, but when they're exploring their relationships, they also make it known who they're with, who they're dating, if they're in relationships, how casual or uncasual those relationships are. And usually somebody that's, a solo polyamorous person isn't really searching for somebody to be like their primary partner. They might have multiple partners. And so I guess it's kind of a broad situation. And I think a lot of it is they're not willing to give up their pursuits or their life dreams or their goals for a relationship. And maybe that also means that they don't want to take things so seriously. Maybe they don't want to deal with finances and moving into a home together and dealing with children and that sort of thing. And so they're wanting to keep their options open. Maybe their career comes first, and maybe they would later on move into a different polyamorous relationship where they have a primary partner. Maybe they would actually move into a monogamous relationship at some time. But right now, to me, when I think about, solo polyamorous relationship, I think about somebody that's not willing to settle down, is not ready to settle down, doesn't want to settle down, is looking around for things, and taking their time to get to know people and to experience different things. And I just think this is so important. We're going to talk about more polyamorous relationships and what they mean and how the connections are and who's involved here in just a bit. But I feel like the more we understand relationships in general, because does a relationship have to be a man and a woman, or a woman and a man, or a man and a man, or a woman and a woman? What constitutes a relationship? What constitutes a healthy relationship? And, I know that there's a lot of folks out there that say, that maybe they haven't had sex in several years. I mean, I've even worked with clients that hadn't had sex in 10 years. 10 years and they're married. And I'm not saying that, being in a polyamorous relationship is your end-all be-all to success, but I'm saying let's look at all these options and just look and see the options that are out there, and also understanding what some people have chosen. Maybe you would want to choose this, or maybe you want to stay far away from it, but at least we have the information and we can understand what's going on. When I return, I'll be talking more about different polyamorous relationships and the interactions, who's involved, how many people are involved, and the list goes on. So don't change the channel, because we got a lot more to talk about. Live your true life perspectives. With me, your host, Ashley Burgess, will be back in. I'll be back this time. I'll be back this time in 2 shakes.
Turn it up and jump in the deep end on Perspectives. Now, here's Ashley.
Welcome back live to Live Your True Life Perspectives, and I'm your host, Ashley Burgess. On today's show, we're talking about relationships, but more specifically, polyamorous relationships. And right before the break, I was talking about solo polyamorous relationships, and how basically, to me, that's someone that's not settling down, isn't looking for a soulmate at this time, isn't wanting to settle down, isn't wanting to have, that type of relationship, has other goals or desires, or just wanting to get to know themselves in mind. And that's what that really comes to mind when I think about that. Talking about V relationships is, when a person is in a relationship or dating two people who are not involved with each other, that's a V polyamorous relationship. The easiest way to understand this type is actually the letter V. So there are 3 points in the letter V. one point is connected to both, and the other two are only connected to the center point. So that gives you an example. For example, John is dating, Monica and Michelle. Monica and Michelle are not dating each other or sexually involved with each other. They're only involved with John. So the concept is pretty obvious, is that one person is having a relationship with two different people, but those two different people are not having a relationship with each other. And so, in these relationships, it needs to be known that everybody knows the situation and everybody understands that. And I think that's obviously the difference between a polyamorous V and just somebody that's dating two people that the other person doesn't know about. And that takes dedication. It takes honesty. It takes strength. And that can be very hard because somebody might not be able to deal with the jealousy or the fear of the other person dating two different people and what that means. And so I find that you have to be very open and honest in a relationship like this, and everybody has to be that way, not just accepting this reality, because you feel like you have to. You are doing it because that's something that you're okay with doing. And that's where the rubber meets the road. So very different than somebody just kind of dating, two people and both people not knowing about it. The V situation is obviously when the person, John, in this situation, has told both these women that he's dating both of them and having sex with both of them, that sort of thing, and that they're on board with that. The next one that I want to talk about is the triad, and you might have heard that before. And it's similar to the V relationship because there are three people involved, right? Triad, three, but it's different. So instead of John with those other two women independent of each other, all three of them are involved romantically and sexually, right? So now it is kind of the triangle. So the whole triangle connects together. All three people connected, all three people interacting, all three people in a relationship. And so that's where that gets interesting as well, because that's three people talking together. That's three people hanging out. Those three people could live together. Those three people might not live together. Those three people, there's a lot of, they could hang out together. They could also, they're all in that relationship together, and they're all involved together romantically and sexually. So, we see a lot of that nowadays with people where they found one person, they have another. We see where people move in those situations. We see where even in some of these situations where somebody's married, so let's say like, John and Mary are married, and then, John and Mary meet Joanna, and Joanna comes in and moves in as well and becomes part of the family and part of the family dynamic. We've also seen it as far as where people will move in and also be a part of the family with taking care of the kids or being there. So it can have an interesting role as well. And I'd love to be able to interview some folks that are in these triads to understand, because I definitely think that there are probably some benefits to it. There's also some pitfalls and some issues and maybe some jealousy and things like that would need to be discovered and understood. And for some people, this might be a perfect situation because it takes the stress off of them, or they feel like, the more the merrier, or it's a big happy family or what have you. And so it'd be interesting to talk about that. But when we return, we're going to be talking about more different polyamorous relationships, what they mean, who's involved, and that type of situation, just to educate ourselves and understand better. Stay tuned. Live Your True Life Perspectives with me, your host, Ashley Burgess, will be back in. I'll be back this time in 2 shakes.
This is Jake Busey, and you're listening to Perspectives with Ashley Burgess.
Welcome back live to Live Your True Life Perspectives, and I'm your host, Ashley Burgess. On today's episode of Live Your True Life Perspectives, I'm discussing various types of relationships, polyamorous relationships, and right before the break, we were talking about the triad, or the throuple, which is the three people involved. All three people are connected, and they're all three connected in a relationship. They're all three romantic. They're all three sexual. They're all connected. Whether they're all three at one time connected, or one with another, or one with another. But usually we see this is pretty much the typical polyamorous relationship. And I don't want to say typical, but that may be something that we see more often than other types of polyamorous relationships. Now, the reason why we're talking about this is that, this is a buzzword right now. Lots of folks are talking about being in polyamorous relationships. We're constantly seeing news articles where people are talking about how, they are in a polyamorous relationship and they're in, they're in this relationship and they're in a quad, they're in a triad and it works really well. Maybe they're raising their children together. This also shows how some people might be, in a monopoly where you have a situation where one person wants to stay monogamous and the other person doesn't. So they bring someone in and they have that interaction, even though one person's not, connecting with that other person and one person might be connecting with both people. We have that connection. And a lot of times I think it is because maybe the deal breaker was the sex situation. The deal breaker was the lack there of sexual interaction. They're not feeling as though they're getting what they want in life, but they feel that the marriage itself or the relationship itself, is strong enough to handle that. And there's some good pieces about that relationship that they like and that they connect with. And that's something that's very powerful, is that, you don't want to wreck everything for a piece that's not working. And it's interesting too. I do believe that we can love multiple people. And I believe that we should be loving everybody unconditionally to some degree, as long as we can understand how to love ourselves unconditionally. But I don't think that we only have to love one person in our life. I think you can love multiple people. And so you may have fallen in love with somebody that, having them in your life provides something to you that you really, really, really love. And so it's hard for you to leave that. And then having that conversation and being able to open your life up with that person can be powerful if everybody is open to that and able to accept that reality, which may be easier for some and harder for others. And I think that, the jealousy piece and the insecurity piece is some of the toughest things to overcome in a polyamorous relationship because of that insecurity, but also and the jealousy. But I also think that maybe on the flip side, the abandonment piece maybe kind of falls off a bit, and maybe that fear kind of is dissipated as well. And also maybe not having to just accept things that you don't want. A lot of folks are in relationships right now where you're accepting a relationship that for the part of it, you're in acceptance of, but there's things that you don't really appreciate about the relationships or things that are lacking thereof from the relationship that you don't want to continue to have lacking. And I think that that's something that we really need to recognize as well, is what are you dealing with in your relationship that maybe you don't necessarily want to deal with a relationship, or maybe what are the things that you are accepting that you necessarily don't want to accept. And those are interesting things to ask yourself. And anybody that's been in a longer term relationship probably needs to be thinking about this. And not going into, a polyamorous relationship perhaps, but I'm saying about thinking about, where is your relationship at right now? Is it bringing you joy? Do you feel like you're bringing that other person joy? Are there things that you're sacrificing that is getting in the way of your happiness? What are those things that are getting in the way of your happiness? And these are things to think about. And not that this is the answer, just we're asking the questions to see and say, okay, what are some of the questions that I may need to be asking my spouse? What are some things that I need to get out in the open and discuss? What are some things that I feel I need to put out there so that they understand where I stand or how I feel? And this can be very challenging, right? I mean, because, if you've been married for a long period of time, married life, there's some real benefits there. But, you could be sacrificing yourself to a point where you're starting to get disillusioned with the relationship, or you're starting to lose that connection with that person because it almost feels as though they are not providing or do not want to provide certain things, or holding back from certain things in the relationship. I want to jump right now into the quad relationship. If you're looking at polyamorous and you're looking at a polyamorous relationship, a quad relationship is the four people who are all connected. They are all participants in the relationship, and they're all dating each other. So they're all romantically tied to one another. So there's a couple of options and dynamics that could be in this type of relationship. That's interesting. But the quad relationship, you could have like maybe primary couples adds 2 new people to the relationship, or they find another couple to date. Sometimes maybe the couples were married and have an open relationship, an open marriage. And sometimes maybe they are just really serious. Maybe it's 2 couples engaged in a quad relationship, and each person has a primary or secondary partner as well. It might not be that at all, but usually it's 2 couples that come together, and you have one person, each couple came in with their spouse or their primary partner, and then they connect with this other couple, and so all 4 people are interacting to some degree. And that's interesting too. But again, that the more we add, the more people involved, the more things that have to take place, the more everybody has to be at a certain level of being able to speak their truth, the more everybody has to deal with their own insecurities or their jealousy or their fears. So there's a lot of things that go into it. And I feel like, in these types of relationships, and, again, I want to do some good interviews with folks, is that I find that maybe in these types of relationships, maybe people talk more than holding it internally. And I think that's a situation too, is that I think many people in the monogamous relationship are having trouble expressing themselves to their partner, to have those interactions, to have that communication. And I think that that's something that needs to be discovered and understood. I also feel to some degree too that I think in a polyamorous relationship, you obviously have to have communication. If you don't have communication, this is going to be a complete breakdown in the process. And I think that a lot of times with a monogamous marriage, it can be challenging because you don't want to rock the boat, and it might be easier to sweep things under the rug. And I'm sure in any relationship, it's easier to sweep things under the rug. But I feel like in one of these, with these many people involved, there's got to be a lot of moving parts. And these parts, they have to move together, and everybody has to kind of work together to continue to make this a reality. And I think too, when we look at monogamous relationships, I think for most part they seem pretty easy. But, as I delve into them in my work, I find that many people are dealing with stuff that's left unsaid. Many people are dealing with issues that they want to bring up that they don't know how to bring up. Sometimes there's these things that have been, pushed and stuck under the rug for a long, long time. And no solution has been found. No help, no dedication to look at that. And maybe there's that unsaid situation that is bugging the heck out of everybody that nobody's talking about. And those are the things that we really have to reveal. Those are the things that we need to understand. And I think that in these types of relationships, maybe there's more of an openness to discuss things because you're in such an open relationship that there's so many people involved that's a part. And so even if you're in a monogamous relationship right now, maybe we can take some information from this and say, okay, I might be in a monogamous relationship, but I need to start opening the lines of communication so that we can talk about things that might not be working in the relationship. So we can talk and understand where each person's coming from and start looking for solution, or just allow the other person to speak their mind or to speak their truth or to express how they feel. We also have in the polyamorous relationships, we have a hierarchy, which is it's a relationship where 3 people are involved, and the structure of the relationship consists of a primary partner and a secondary partner. So there's kind of a hierarchy in the situation, in the chain of command. So one relationship has more importance over other relationships in the group. And what you normally find in these relationships are 2 people are married or have been together for a long time, and they work with each other on life decisions, on family, on finances, and then they prioritize themselves over the additional person that's involved. Usually those primary partners are living together, sharing a home. They may even have children together. And, they are kind of the hierarchy. And then you have that additional partner who would be kind of considered the non-primary secondary partner. They're dating this other person, but that person doesn't come first. The primary relationship comes first. those two people rely on each other to make those decisions regarding their finances, their home, their work, their kids. They still care about the other person, but that person is not part of those plans or part of those decisions. So there's some decisions that, are made, and then there's some decisions that are made just by those two people instead of the group of three. See, so that would be kind of the difference in the hierarchy. You also have the other polyamorous relationship where there isn't a hierarchy, and so it's the opposite. So there is no primary partner, and the three people involved are equally involved in all major decisions, right? So everyone in the relationship is unique. They all come to the table with the same level. They're all together. But it's not the two people making the decisions, the important decisions. All three of these folks, all three of these partners focusing on helping each other meet the needs of everyone. And so everybody kind of has a vote. Everybody is just as important as the other person. And that's something to think about too. That's another type of relationship that we see when we look at polyamorous relationships and those types of things. And that's very powerful stuff because, again, you think about, making those decisions and how that works and what does that look like. And creating that. But again, what's interesting that I find in these relationships, you have some that are very structured, some that are less structured. So there's some rules in some. The other thing that I find that's interesting is that you also have relationships within the situation where, everybody kind of knows the pecking order. Also within these relationships, everybody knows where they stand. There's not information being left out. And the last one that I want to talk about is kind of the kitchen table polyamorous relationships, and that's the family unit. Everybody's in the family. Everybody's emotionally connected, and even if they're not romantically involved, they're all emotionally connected. Everybody goes to family dinners. Everybody gathers for events. Everybody supports one another. Everybody's together, and they might not all be dating one another, but they are together. They still have this emotional connection. They hang out with each other. They support one another. They help each other through their needs. They participate in their life. And so that's a very interesting dynamic. And that's kind of where the family dynamic is involved. And the family unit is not lost. And they can still, some of the times they can live independently, but at the same point, that family unit, it comes first, and that's kind of where we're kind of seeing that situation. So, there's various different types of these types of relationships. But I think that we have to be able to, think about relationships in general. What are we looking for in a relationship? It might not be this at all. These are just ideas, and I'm not pushing polyamorous relationships on anybody. But what I'm saying is that I think a lot of us haven't maybe asked the big questions in our relationship, or maybe are you being honest with yourself? Are you currently in a relationship that brings you joy? Are you currently happy in that relationship? Is there things in that relationship that aren't working for you? And you don't have to make major changes. We can just have some conversation and open the line of communication to be able to communicate some of these things, right? To be able to open our minds and communicate. And I think that the reason for the show today is really to understand that there's no set way of doing anything. There's no, this has to be this way or the highway, or you have to follow this protocol, or you have to be with this person, or you have to be in this type of relationship. I think that we have to step back from those rules and start asking ourselves, what is it that I want in my life? What do I need to augment in my current situation to make myself more happy, to make the situation happier, to make the situation more joy-filled, to make the situation more healthy for everybody concerned. And I find that when we're able to explore the spaces more and ask some of those questions, we don't get so stuck in a rut like we are a lot of times, more often than not, when we're dealing with it, because we're so stuck in the ways that things have to be. And so, I don't change the channel, because there's more coming up, because I want to start asking those questions. Are you happy? I'm going to ask some of these questions here at the end of the show, kind of a checklist of things that you can begin to examine in your own life to understand, is there something that you want to augment or change in your current relationship? Is there something that you want to augment, change, or, change up that would really benefit you in a way that would help you? Is there some questions that you need to ask your spouse or significant other, but better yet, are there some questions that you need to ask yourself that we need to figure out and understand the answers to those questions to benefit our life? That's the important question. So stay tuned. Live Your True Life Perspectives with your host, me, Ashley Burgess, will be back in. I'll be back this time in 2 shakes.
Get in here. You're listening to Perspectives with Ashley Burgess.
Welcome back live to Live Your True Life Perspectives, and I'm your host, Ashley Burgess. On today's show, I've been talking about relationships, specifically polyamorous relationships, and the different types of polyamorous relationships that exist. And the reason for this show is that I'm expanding the thought process of what relationships are. And I think that many of us are in monogamous relationships, and that's great. But many of us have a lot of things that we need to discuss in these monogamous relationships that are not being discussed. We're not having the conversations. We're not opening the lines of communication. We're not discussing or discussing our needs or wants or desires. And instead, you're putting things on hold because you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to ask the questions. But I really think more sincerely, it's not necessarily, yes, it's about asking your spouse or your significant other questions. But I think that it's also asking yourself the questions. Are you happy in your current relationship? That's a big question. Are you happy in your current relationship? Are there things that you would like to see different? Are there things in your situation that you would like to see change or augment? What are those things that you would like to see changed or augment? Have you brought these things up to your spouse or significant other? And I know that many of you say, well, I haven't because I don't even know where to begin, or I'm overwhelmed, or I don't know what to do, or what if it did change? Would I want that? And these are all questions to ask, but if you haven't brought it up to them, why haven't you? What's standing in the way of you bringing it up? What's standing in the way of you asking those questions? What's standing in the way of you having this communication with them? And, so I really think that a great idea for everybody that's listening to the show is spending some time with your spouse or significant other and just listening and taking into consideration the things that they're bringing to the table. Take in their personality, what they're going through, their outlook, how they communicate, how you communicate. Do you have a good relationship with them? What is missing from that relationship? Are these things that are missing, are these deal breakers for you? Are these things that have you looking elsewhere? Are these things that have you worried about the dedication of the relationship? All these are viable questions that need to be asked. And I think that these questions have to be asked of you first. And then there's some questions that you will want to ask your significant other. And these are powerful. These are powerful questions that need to be asked. These are powerful questions that we need to think about, and if you haven't asked them, you need to explore yourself. What are you looking for? What is the answer? What do you want out of this relationship? Many of you may have been married for a long period of time. Have there been things in the marriage that have been pushed off to the side? Are there some needs that are not being fulfilled in your marriage that you want fulfilled? Those are things that you need to think about. Can you fulfill those things on your own? Because some of the things that you might want can be taken care of by you. Some of the things that you want might be taken care of by a friend, like interaction, like communication, spirituality communication, talk like that. Maybe, you're looking for your spouse to be everything, and that's not possible. That's not possible. Are there things that you want your spouse to do that it's a situation for a spouse to do that's not being done? How do you open that line of communication without hurting that person's feelings or scaring them? Those are questions. But again, it goes back to, how do we begin to open that communication, not only with you, but also your spouse or your significant other? And then how do we see things a little bit different to offer ourselves solutions and help to see that, it's not doomsday. And the reason why I brought up the polyamorous relationships is there's a lot of people that are choosing various different ways to live their life. And I think that a lot of us have been so connected to the way we have to live that it's hard to sit there and say, there are options, but even if there aren't, if that's not the option I want to take, why don't we start talking about how we really feel to get our feelings out there to take off that mask, to have that communication, and to ultimately see if there's a possibility of things working out. Because we never know how things will work out if we don't ask the questions. We really don't know how things are going to work out if we don't ask those big questions of ourselves and of others. And I hope that this has helped many of y'all just out there who are wondering what to do. And those questions are big. If you can write those answers down, think about it. Why are you happy? Are there things that need to be different? What are the things that need to be different? Have you brought it up? Have you not? Why haven't you? What's holding you back from asking those questions? What's holding you back from understanding what it is that you want in your life? Are you worthy of having what you want in your life? Are you allowed to have what you want in your life? These are the questions. I have a great show coming up next week, so don't miss that as well. Check out the YouTube channel when you get a chance. Go to YouTube, search Ashley Berges, Ashley Berges, and look forward to seeing you next week. Live Your True Life Perspectives with your host, me, Ashley Burgess, will be back in. I'll be back this time. You know it. I'll be back this time in 3 shakes.